Hi. Today we want to look at solving equations. And when we talk about solving an equation, you guys have made equations. Like I have, we've made equations of lines and things like that. But today we're going to look at how we can be given a certain type of equation that we can actually get an answer to. And the trick to this is thinking like a child, which for some of us comes easily, and for some of you might come more difficultly. So let's take a look and see what we can come up with. So the idea behind this really comes down to this. An equation is kind of a complicated way of telling you a number. And I could say, I'm thinking of a number, and my number plus 2 is equal to 8. And you could be like, well, that's really stupid and an unnecessarily complicated way of saying your number. And I could say, yeah, that's true, but you could figure it out, because you'd say, okay, well, you have some number, and that number and 2 bigger is equal to 8. And you probably know your addition facts well enough, or you can count on your fingers, that you could figure out that that number must be 6. You could figure that out. But what we want to teach you today is a way to deal with numbers like that when they're a little bit more complicated and give you the skills you need to solve that. And that's going to come up a lot in math, so it's going to be a helpful skill. So let's try that, shall we? So here we are. Let's look at this in math terms, in what we call algebra. And algebra is just a fancy way of saying using letters and numbers to solve equations in math. So, using letters and numbers, I could say this, where I could say x, which means I have some number that I'm thinking of. And that number that I'm thinking of, if I add 2 to it, is equal to 8. Now again, you probably know enough math facts that you can just, do that math. But the trick to algebra is that if we take this number, we can always do the opposite. Doing the opposite will help us solve. Because what I've really done is I've said, I have this number x, and to make it sneaky, I'm not going to tell you what x is, I'm going to tell you what x plus 2 is. I've used plus 2 to make this number more complicated. And what you can do is you can just undo what I've done. Now the reason I say this is like having a kid is because if you have a little kid in your life, you know that anything you do, they're going to undo. If you're trying to put their boots on, they're going to take their boots off. If you try to put their coat on, they're going to take their coat off. Whatever you do, they're going to undo, and they're going to make things more complicated. So what I've done here is I've added 2 to make it more complicated, and you have to undo that. So what's the opposite of adding 2? The opposite of adding 2 is taking away 2. So here's what we do in math. To do algebra, we would look at this and we'd say, okay, they have added 2. That's how they have made this more complicated. And the opposite of adding 2 is taking 2 away. That will undo that. They've added 2. If I take 2 away, that is going to serve to undo this change that they've made. But because it's an equation sign, because it's equal, I have to treat both sides equally. So if I take 2 away from this side to undo the change, I've got to take 2 away from that side. If that sounds a little weird, with a bit of practice, we'll learn the algebra. But then we can say, okay, x is still over here. I didn't get rid of that. And that equals 8 minus 2. And then you can just do 8 minus 2 either in your head or in a calculator, and you get 8 equals 6. And that will tell you what your unknown number was. So what we've done is we've taken a complicated thing they've done and we've uncomplicated it by being a little child, by undoing what they did, by doing the opposite. So let's try a few examples of this, just to make sure we have it. So here we have another one, x plus 7 equals 9. So maybe you can even take a minute and try this. Try it out, see if you can figure it out. Now again, maybe you can do this in your head. You can say, well, there's some number, and if we make it 7 bigger, it's equal to 9, and maybe you can just figure that out. But try not to approach it that way for a minute. Try to think of undoing the change here. So in this case, adding 7 is what's been done to make it complicated, and the opposite of adding 7 is subtracting 7. That's going to get rid of that change. But because it's an equation, what we do to one side, we have to do to the other. And so now we'd rewrite this, that x is still over here, but there's no longer any numbers here because to undo the adding 7, we subtracted the 7. And we say our number must be that 9, but we had to take away 7 from it. And then that you can either do in your head or you can use a calculator, but 9 minus 7 is 2. And that means that this number that we didn't know must be 2. Our number was 2 all along. So they said we have some number, and if you add it to 7, it equals 9, and that equals 2. Why don't you try this one? Just give it a minute, try it out, see how that goes for you. X minus 4 equals 2. Well, you can work that out. Again, we're going to do the opposite. The opposite of subtracting 4, which is what's been done to make this complicated, is adding 4. So we can kind of cross that off. And if we're going to add 4 to one side, we're going to add 4 to the other side. So don't be fooled just because it's subtraction. No worries, we know what the opposite of subtracting is. The opposite of subtracting is adding. Just got to think like a little kid, undo. And always line those equal signs up, that's good form. The only thing left over here is an x, but over here we had the 2, and we added 4 to it. And then again, you can probably do that in your head, but if you can't, use a calculator. 2 plus 4 is 6. And I'm going to call an audible right now and just throw some decimals in here, just to show you that these don't have to be nice numbers. They can be ugly numbers, and we can still figure that out because we're clever folk. We are clever folk. So here, if we had x plus 4.3 equals 16.8, this you probably can't do in your head. I mean, maybe you can. Maybe you're really good at mental math, in which case, great. But if you're like me, I have no idea what number plus 4.3 equals 16.8, but that's okay, because the trick to solving any equation is just to think like a child. In this case, we have our number x, we don't know it, but we know that it's been made more complicated by adding 4.3. And the opposite of adding 4.3 is subtracting 4.3. That's going to make that just go away. But because it's an equation, what I do to one side, I have to do to the other side. And then we can say, all right, we line that equal sign up. The only thing left on the x is our number that we don't know. And over here we have 16.8 minus 4.3. And then, again, if you can do that in your head, great. But if not, just do it in the calculator. 16.8 minus 4.3 is equal to 12.5. And so our number x has to be 12.5. And that is how we solve an equation with adding, just like that. So you're going to try a few below, and I'm sure you'll do a great job.